Thank you very much. It's good to be here. This joint research with my Cardiff colleagues, Mona Aranea and Leon Gooberman. The project is funded by the Hans Böckler Foundation. It's a 32-month project, and we are about in the 7th, 8th month of the research, so in a fairly early stage, and we would really welcome to kind of any comments to further shape the research project, and we are still able to take new suggestions on board. So what are European employers' organizations? They are the counterpart of trade unions or trade union federations. They usually have members of national employers' organizations, but also sometimes individual firms, and they represent employer interests in the European Union. So the large bulk of them is located in Brussels, and they're targeting the European institutions. They charge a membership fee, which is important to differentiate them from think tanks, which are kind of rather based on funding from wealthy donors, and here it's really membership-based. And they focus on the European level and have a primary focus there, which helps them to differentiate from international or global employers' organizations, as well as national employers' organizations. And they're active in the area of work, labor, and employment relations. And we probably go slightly wider in our definitions of previous research. So often when people talk about European employers' organizations, they refer to the European social partner organizations, but we explicitly said, well, there are plenty of other organizations out there who lobby, influence, and shape work and employment, and we need to look at those as well. Our question is quite straightforward. How do European employers' organizations represent the interests of their members in the European Union? Why European employers' organizations? So this little picture here from the European Trade Union Institute, two stacks here, and there's for employers' organization research, national, international, and there's barely any literature in particular on European employers' organizations, right? And if we would write books, the ambition would be to fill the shelves, but we only write papers. And so very little literature on employers at the EU level. There's some studies on lobbying of business and trade associations. There's research on sectoral social dialogue, but very little with an explicit focus on employers. Obviously, it's possible to examine and look at the topic from different angles, and our vision, our Google for today would be the literature on interest representation. Obviously, then different theoretical frames emphasize different elements of what's out there, and so we use here kind of the interest representation literature to gain a perspective on European employers' organizations. And there's a pluralism literature which suggests that there are competing interests within a political system, and they almost balance each other out, and as part of a vibrant democracy, different interests represent their interest vis-a-vis political parties or political authority. And Streeck and Schmitter suggested in the early 90s that there's a move from national corporatism to transnational pluralism, referring to the European Union here. There's this idea of voluntarism, that employers and unions organize industrial relations without governance interference. Streeck again talked about European neo-voluntarism. We all know the literature on corporatism. It's really the formal integration of employers and unions in political structures, and quite importantly for corporatism, there's a delegation of authority to the social partners and to employers' organizations. And Schäfer and Streeck, they talked about symbolic Eurocorporatism. Marxism suggests they also dealt with interest groups. They suggest, well, there's a different logic for employers' organizations and unions. The state usually have to give preferential treatment to the employers because they're more needed for the economy, they're responsible for economic growth, because of those dependencies on these kind of economic outcomes, employers tend to be less in need of collective representation compared to labor unions. Another take on on the role of employers' organization is by De Gries and Pochet from the European Trade Union Institute, and they talk about employers' organizations as reluctant social partners on the European level. Research methods, I glide fairly quickly about that. We had initially to identify the sample. We found about 140 organizations, while there are about 65, 70 European social partner organizations. So we really go beyond the previous focus here. And then we have been compiling a database on European employers' organization, capturing and collecting publicly available information from European employers' organizations from different sources, primarily from the websites of employers' organizations. Obviously, that's a somewhat shallow data gathering on employers' organizations, and we complement it then with an interview program of roughly 110 interviews, and we have done maybe 30, 40. So our argument, or you could say the hypothesis, as it is in a fairly early stage, that there are 4 channels of European employer interest representation. So there's a European sectoral social dialogue, or the European social dialogue. There's political representation. Employer organizations are involved in standard setting and unilateral standard setting. And there's a service provision to their members. They're going to talk about each of these channels respectively. So the European social dialogue, there exists 2 types. The European cross-sectoral social dialogue, that's really with a general employers organization that cut across the different sectors like Business Europe, and there was a couple of important attempts in the 1990s to come up with joint regulation and joint legislation on the European level, and there were a couple of important directives in this area. For example, the European Works Council Directive, or the Working Time Directive and Parental Leave Directive. And in these European cross-sectoral social dialogue, the legislative process was slightly different for each of them, but in each of these processes, European employers' organizations were involved. And this type of policy making has been less common in the last 20 years or so, and nowadays it's really kind of a sectoral social dialogue between European employers' organization and the representatives from national employers and national unions. And in some sectors you have kind of some joint regulation there, voluntary joint regulation, but in other sectors there's barely anything happening. And there's actually quite a bit of research on sectoral social dialogue. Valeria did some very interesting research, and we tried to probably look more specifically at the role of employers' organization. But there are also aspiring social partners. So there's a list who tries to apply and become gradually kind of one of the European social partner organizations. An interesting case would be the UEFA, the European Football Association. But then you have also some other trade and business associations who join European sectoral social dialogue through other EEOs. So there's a bit of a structure there. A very important one for us is political representation. There's a diverse and complex political structure. There are the meetings by the Department Employment of the European Commission that organizes meetings and brings the social partners together. And they have really the European Commission and the DG Employment, they try to involve labor unions and employers' organizations in policy making. And there's a regularly consultation on new initiatives, but often they are only really revisions of previous directives and previous legislative initiatives on the European level. and there's just some minor adjustment very often. And so it's still happening, but much less popularly compared to the 90s. We're interested in the informal lobbying, how they really approach topics, and we kind of, I think we start to gather data there. So if they have a topic that they're concerned about, and how they then really bring it to the attention of their national authorities and as well to the national employers organizations. So they have in a way kind of an early warning system for national employers, and if something is happening there at the European level, that's one of their tasks to be then on the case, and there you would find then coordination and then coalitions between employers and also campaigns then on certain topics. And it's mostly about legislative initiatives by the European Commission. In the standard setting area, it's really probably the evidence we have so far is the most shallow, and we have to probe more and gather further evidence. So you have in some areas certification provided by European employers organizations, and they provide a certificate for certain job roles across Europe, and they offer then European certified training for these job roles. There's the European OSHA, the European Health and Safety campaign, and then employers were involved in promoting and implementing standards. But you also have kind of joint statements and initiatives with unions, but they are often really of a softer nature, intending to address certain problems. And then we really also wanted to find out if there's something of the nature of unilateral codes of conduct where they suggest certain practices to their members in terms of behaviors. But otherwise, they're also involved in implementing policy on the European level. The last area would be service provision. You have training seminars and training materials. You have handbooks in terms of how to manage engagement with the European Union, how you can get possibly funding, how they help with the policy implementation. There's platforms of information, but they also provide then a staff exchange program. And we looked if there are any legal services which has become more important on the national level, but they don't seem to be engaged in that. To conclude, we argue in this paper that European employers' organizations represent member interests through 4 channels in the European Union, through European social dialogue, mostly through European sectoral social dialogue, through political representation and lobbying, standard setting, and service provision. If we then come back for like a final evaluation to our theoretical perspectives that might help us to understand employers' organization and just evaluate the different frames based on the evidence we have collected so far. So one might say that the European political economy is to some extent clearly pluralist. There are many different types of interest groups that to some extent cancel each other out, like labor unions and employers' organizations. But on the other hand, employers' organizations and unions have somewhat a privileged role. They receive quite a bit of funding from the European Commission, so generally the European Commission supports the social partner. However, this support for employers and unions doesn't add up to some kind of Euro-corporatism. And what is really missing here is the delegation of policy authority that you find on the national level to employers and unions. That's lacking to really be able to talk about Euro-corporatism. What we then have rather is voluntarist regulation and sectoral social dialogue, where employers and unions voluntarily regulate employment, and here the notion of a reluctant social partner comes in. You find minimal regulation and joint regulation, and in other areas employers are blocking initiatives. In terms of the Marxist perspective, last point, the European Union is clearly mostly a market-making project. And in this context, European employers' organizations are indeed less in need of collective representation compared to labor unions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.